Well, home care is 25 to 50 bucks an hour. Independent living situations can start around 2,500. Obviously, the nicer you are, the more expensive it is. Assisted living is kind of in that range. Nursing care is kind of out of control. There are group home situations. So at 3,500, for example, that is kind of a lower level group home scenario. A group home, if you're not aware, it's a private residence. The owner is typically the caretaker. And they're licensed as a nurse or some type of a caregiver as well. And that 3,500 would typically be a shared bedroom in a private residence, right? Obviously, 10,000 a month, that's a private room in a pretty nice facility. Okay. So let's talk a little bit. What is the private room? Well, according to, this is a Genworth financial analysis, it's a couple years old, but the average private room in a 24/7 nursing facility is around $90,000 a year. That statistic's a little old. I think it's up to about 100 right now. What that means is, average inflation in the United States the last 100 years has been about 3%. So in 10 years, you're looking at 120,000. In 20 years, 150, 130,000. Now, as a practical matter, if we start extrapolating out, after a while, it doesn't make much sense. I mean, who has $212,000 a year to spend on their care, and times 2 if you're a couple? But that's just basic math. That's not me making predictions. So it's important, right? We need to think about, how do we finance this long-term care? What are the strategies we can do? And we don't have a lot of time to get into it, but I want to briefly cover this because this is something everybody should at least be thinking about at some point. So the first strategy is self-insure. Right? Crisis happens, you pay while you can. And this is unfortunately what a lot of people default to. With some, there's no other option because it isn't there. But some people will not go in because they want to save money for their care, and they won't come in and see an elder care or estate planning lawyer to find out what other options are there to try to salvage something. Then there's crisis planning, and this is, okay, we don't know what to do, we're out of money, where do we go? The third is long-term care insurance, which it's not cheap. The average person applies for long-term care. Most recent data I've seen is age 62. And there are many, many different types of long-term care insurance, or LTCI. I'm going to briefly mention some of them. And then fourth, we talk about proactive planning. We create asset protection trusts, where these are irrevocable trusts, not revocable trusts. And we're purposely moving money into these trusts. But the critical thing is to move that money and shelter it from the state if we have to rely on state aid. We have to be thinking at least 5 years ahead. Okay? A typical Medicaid asset protection trust runs about about $7,500. But if you think of it, what we're protecting, you know, at $8,000, $10,000 a month, it's well worth the money if you have the time and the resources to consider. So the first, let's just look at this. Most people are surprised to learn that Medicare does not pay for long-term care. Say it again. Medicare does not pay for long-term care. Each person has 100 days of long-term care per life. But the problem is, let's say someone had some rehab after a broken hip and they spent 40 days. Well, now they only have 60 days. What if they're only 60 years old when that happened? Too bad. So it's very possible that when some people are getting to a point in life where they need permanent long-term care, they don't have anything left. Okay.
Is this hospice you're talking about?
No. This is rehab facilities. Yeah.
What if you haven't used it?
Well, if you haven't used it, then
It goes
you
away.
no, you always keep it. Well, if you don't use it and you die, then it goes away. But let's say you're 85 years old and you haven't used it, then you still have your 100 days.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So let me translate that.
Sure.
بر طبق قانون
This is really
مدیکر
important.
یا قانون مدیکر فقط 100 روز پول میده مدیکر برای مثلا شما داری تراپی میگیری نمیتونی بعد هاسپیتال، یعنی حالتی هست که کمک میخوای بهش میگن لانگ ترم که دراز مدت ازتون میخوان نگهداری بکنن و بعد از اون دیگه تمام دیگه. اگه مثلا شما
After 65.
مثلا تصادف کردی 30 روز رفتی تراپی یا 40 روز رفتی تراپی، اون کم میشه از اون 100 روز. اگه دفعه بعد مثلا احتیاج داشته باشید دیگه اون 100 روز به شما نمیاد. ایشون دارن میگن که خیلی خوبه که همه ما برای اون یا خودمون فکر بکنیم که اگر احیانا یه موقع مجبور شدیم مثلا مدت خیلی زیادی ازمون نگهداری بکنن توی بیمارستانی یه جایی، یه فکر راجبش بکنیم، فقط واسه مدیکر فکر نکنیم.
Okay, and then
You find out that, where should we call to find out
what you have?
if you have some,
If you go online, you can get a Social Security statement every year online that may have it. Otherwise, call the Social Security office.
I have to look at social
Yeah,
security.
and they would let you know. If you're on Medicare and you've never gone in for rehab or anything, then you haven't used it. So. How long does self-insure last? Well, a single basically 2 years, and an average person, if it's a couple, it's 12 months. They'll exhaust their life savings. So what I suggest to people is, if you haven't done any planning at all, whether it's someone in this room, a friend, a relative, something like that, and a long-term care incident comes up, and this came up in my family recently, we're talking about crisis planning. Right? Our lawyers who do this type of work, there's not a lot of us, and yeah, we charge for it. We do get paid well. But if you think of the life savings that's going to go out the door if you don't engage somebody sooner rather than later. My next door neighbor, as an example, his parents had absolutely no planning in place. So his father fell and broke his hip, and it became apparent that he can't go home. So last month we did a basic estate plan, and now we're getting all this information together to get him into a crisis plan to get the government to pay for their long-term care needs in a group home. So in crisis planning, seek out early. You can do this when all the savings are exhausted, or engage them sooner. And what does this mean? Well, there's a different strategy for a single person and a married person. And very briefly, if someone is married, what we try to do is get all the assets over to the wife, okay? Or I guess I should say the spouse, but it's usually the wife that gets all the assets first. Sorry, guys. So we try to move all the assets over to the healthy spouse. Now, in order to qualify for government aid, there's an asset test, okay? And to qualify, you basically have to have less than $2,000 of assets in your own name, so virtually nothing. But under the tax code, we can give an unlimited gift with no tax to our spouse, legal spouse. So we give that gift to the spouse to move all the assets over. After that, there's an income test. Okay? And what we can also do is we can convert assets into income for the spouse. And we do that with special annuities. Right? Annuities have a really bad name, and there were some really, really crappy, rapacious annuities that were sold. In order to do this technology, this legal loophole, we get special type of annuities, and there are only a few carriers in the country that sell them. And we can take assets that would disqualify a spouse normally. We buy an annuity, converting that asset into income for the well spouse. Then we qualify the needy spouse to get on the government program. And these special annuities have a really rapid payback. So the goal is to take that asset, convert it into income for the well spouse. These things can pay back everything in as short as 2 months. Sometimes it's as long as 5 years, maybe even longer depending on the needs. But we try to work that legal and financial magic for people. The second option is for an individual where you don't have that spouse to give the gift to. There's still strategies where if you come in early enough, we can maybe save half of that estate for the next generation, or more importantly, we can save it for children who will pay for the things that the government programs won't pay, which is the ideal. Right? You basically get food and you get housing in the government program. But if you protect stuff properly, you can get more than Snickers and haircuts out of this. Right? Maybe you need a vacation to Italy to take care of that lower back pain or something that I'm having right now. I don't know. But we can save up to half the wealth if we come in and talk soon enough, even in these crisis scenarios. Third, we'll talk about long-term care insurance. There's many different types. There's the traditional plan. There's either reimbursement, you give your receipts in, or indemnity. These have really fallen out of favor. If you have an indemnity plan, they're great. But when these were first sold about 25 or 30 years ago, there were a couple hundred insurance companies that dove into this. And they priced that insurance based upon their experience with life insurance. And what they realized was that people were living longer, the care was getting more expensive, and unlike life insurance, there's a certain amount of people that drop off and don't pay. So those people they pay into the system, and then before they use it, they drop out. So all those resources are available. And what happened with these policies that were sold in the 80s and early 90s is the actuaries who calculated this stuff got all the wrong assumptions. Right? People didn't let these go. They let a life insurance policy go, but they don't let their long-term care insurance go. So in order to keep the pools of risk solvent, rates have gone up, sometimes double or triple, depending on the policy and the carrier. Right? The other type, which are very common now, are these hybrid and long-term care policies where you get life insurance. So unlike these things, you pay in, and if you pass away, all that money's gone. With a hybrid policy, you'll have a death benefit, a life insurance benefit that pays out if one passes away. However, if they need long-term care, they'll start chewing away at that death benefit. So the money will get used one way or another. It doesn't go to waste. 401k, IRA, normally when you take out money from a 401k or IRA, you have to pay tax on that money. What we're able to do now, given a Deficit Reduction Act, a federal law a few years ago, is we can convert these policies into asset cares and annuity cares. We can convert those into long-term care plans. There are some long-term care policies that are really, 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 really good. There are others that are atrociously terrible. So you need to work with people who really understand that. I strongly recommend working with independent people. I'll raise my hand, I'm an independent. But if you're stuck selling something for one carrier, it's really difficult to tailor it to the age and risk and finances of a client because they're so unique. It's possible to get a long-term care policy that will have a lifetime benefit. You can never run out. It's possible to get those. And then lastly, there's proactive planning. This is kind of the higher end, very sophisticated estate planning, specifically done by elder law attorneys. And what we'll do is we'll have something called a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust, right? It's not Medicare, it's Medicaid. Most people know of Medicaid, that's the health insurance for people who don't have a lot of resources, health insurance for the poor. Well, they also have a part that's long-term care. And when one cannot afford their own, when we talk about applying for government assistance, we're talking about this program. In Arizona, it's called ALTCS, A-L-T-C-S, the Arizona Long-Term Care System. So Medicaid is a federal program managed at the state level. Each state has their own unique quirks. So the trust maker, that's you, has some money. They create this, you see this is a thick line here, it's an irrevocable trust. So they put a certain amount of their wealth in this trust. Not all of it, because they can't use this, but some of it that they want to protect. We're going to have, instead of the trust maker being the beneficiary, we have a responsible child be the beneficiary, right? So there's trust involved in this. We're also going to make the responsible child the trustee. Remember, the trust maker makes the trust, puts their property in. The trustee manages the property in the trust for the benefit of the beneficiary. Now, it's at this point when you say, well, why the heck would I do that? Well, the reason is, what we're trying to do, if we can go that 5 years, so Medicaid doesn't look at it, they can't claw it back, we can take some distributions out of here for the responsible child when mom and dad are in the nursing home. And then this is a dotted line, so it's not a mandatory distribution. But the responsible child over here who gets something, maybe they put some cash into a checking account for 6 months, and then they want to give gifts. Now, after 5 years, the government can't come after this money. So you can get qualified for Medicaid if you have a lawyer help you with this. And then if you have some responsible child or nephew, whomever, somebody you can trust, your housing and your food are cared for over here, but your vacations, everything else can be funded out of this. So we can really shift around a lot of the loose. And again, I'll say again, there's a 5-year look back. Anything you give away, and this is critical because a lot of people who are faced with a crisis, like, okay, I'm going to give it all, I'm going to write these checks to my kids, and then they come in and they want some help. And we're like, sorry. Everything you've given away is now, in the last 5 years as a gift, is now subject to a clawback by the government, and they wind up losing everything because then there's nothing we can do. And then I just have 2 slides left. I do these whenever I'm speaking with someone. No matter what, I speak for various different things. 4 financial toilets to avoid to get financial security. Interest, bank fees, heavy loans, taxes, depreciation, and market losses. If you don't know what those are, speak to somebody who knows finance, because it can really make a difference in your life if you start learning shaving stuff down. And then the third thing is this book, The Richest Man in Babylon. My father gave me a copy of this when I was 14. I read it every year. I preach it to people whenever I can. I've literally purchased thousands of copies of this in my life. I buy them by the bucket load from Amazon. I give them to homeless people, weddings, graduations, everything. This book was written in 1926 by George S. Clason. Now, Mr. Clason was a map entrepreneur. At one time, he had the largest map company in the world, the Clason Map Company in Denver, Colorado. And he realized that no matter how much money people were making, they're always broke. His right-hand man, the person he was counting on to take over the company, was always broke. The kid sweeping the shop who made 1/10 of the right-hand man, that kid's broke. So what he wound up doing, it's a short book, about 126 pages in it. He started writing little parables, right? Little stories, kind of like this tale of two families we saw at the beginning, a little parable to teach a lesson. And he wrote a whole bunch of these, and in 1926 they put them together and they put them in this book. And what I like so much about it, aside from the lessons and the parables, is the setting is 2,500 years ago in ancient Babylon. The principles are timeless. It's not about a religion, a race, a culture, a language. It's not about industrial technology or financial technology. The principles are absolutely timeless. And I read this book. I did exactly what it said. Go to church on Sundays. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. It's really the basics. The one thing I deviated from this, one of the big rules, is save not less than 1/10. And I just kind of took that to an extreme. And when my income started to go up in my other career, my lifestyle didn't. And that enabled me to retire in my late 30s. And now I can do something like this where I can help a lot more people. that's the end.
All right, thank you.
I didn't think we were gonna go this long, so,